We're in Daniel chapter 3, and Daniel chapter 3, and really there's several other incidents, most notably chapter 6 when we get to that, but maybe this one, along with chapter 6, I feel like sometimes we have a great tendency not to trivialize it, but maybe just to reserve it, if you will, for children's classes. And our children certainly need to learn the lesson that is described here in chapter 3, but sometimes we just think about those types of stories and just say, well, that's for VBS, or that's for the children's storybook, or the nighttime before you go to bed kind of reading. But there's much more to it than that. Another good example, for instance, if you talk about Noah and the ark, and you talk about here's the ark and here are all the little pairs of animals, and that's a cute story, and you can make your child's nursery decorations match that sort of thing. You can even advance, as we did during Dino Day, and talk about the geological, upheaval that was brought about by the flood, and that's interesting. You can go to the top of Black Mountain and find seashells. Some of you have done that. You say, how did seashells get on the top of Black Mountain? Well, there was some cataclysmic event that led to that. But underlying all of that, of course, was God's great displeasure and His judgment on the entire earth, so He wiped it out. When we come to Daniel chapter 3, we read about some boys in a fire. And that's pretty graphic, and maybe even a little gruesome. You see the picture on screen. I don't know, this may be depicting a firefighter. I guess that's kind of, or maybe a guy fighting a wildfire. Those brave men and women who work in that field, they have the appreciation of all of us, because most of us, we have a great aversion to the idea of fire. It's scary to us, for sure. I can tell you, and again, if someone's listening or watching and don't know my background, working in the funeral industry, that was always one of the most difficult set of circumstances to deal with when a family lost those by fire. And I know we've had some even in our area, in our family lately that have done that. It's just, there's some added, element to it that causes sorrow. And I won't tell you stories that'll just turn you inside out with grief and sorrow and other things. I'm not going to do that, but those exist, and those are very traumatic, not just for the survivors, but even those who try to come alongside to help others process that sort of loss. I can speak to that firsthand. Anybody know the story of August Landmesser? My German is very poor, but August Landmesser. Now, we don't have a high definition projector necessarily, but maybe you can squint well enough to see this little incident that's going on here. August Landmesser was a German. He, in 1931, joined the Nazi Party. That was the thing to do in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s. But Mr. Landmesser was engaged. His fiancée was Miss Eckler, who was a Jew. And following the passing of the Nuremberg laws, of course, Germany outlawed any sort of association with the German race, with the Jewish race, and certainly forbade marriage between Germans and Jews. And Mr. Landmesser, though, he still loved Miss Eckler, and he wasn't going to comply. When Hitler visited a shipyard, I think this is in Hamburg maybe, in 1936, they're making preparations for war, of course, and the Fuhrer came by, and to show allegiance, of course, everyone saluted him. And you know that typical gesture on how it was done. Everyone except Mr. Landmesser here. Now, that's just one of those interesting photos from history that says so very much. It wasn't until some years later that it was actually discovered his identity, because he would not give up his relationship with Miss Eckler. Both he and she and other members of the family were sent to concentration camps. He was a German sent to German concentration camps. It's quite amazing. He spent some time there. He was eventually paroled only because Nazi Germany was, of course, being overrun by the Allies and put in a fugitive fighting force where in 1945 he was lost in battle, presumably, and was declared killed in action, I think, in 1949. One of his daughters survived. He and Miss Eckler did have children. One of his daughters survived, and in 1990 or 91, she wrote a book kind of detailing their family history. And this photo kind of confirms that. But how do you stand out, I guess, is the point we're asking. How do you stand against the crowd? How do you go against what everyone else is doing when everyone else is not doing what they should be doing. And that's a very, very difficult thing to process. And that's all of what Daniel chapter 3 is about. I hope you're there. In your Bible, we can't read it in its entirety. We can't do that in any of these sessions. What I encourage you to do, to read ahead. So next week, go ahead and have read chapter 4 at least once, maybe several times between now and then. I hope you've done that for chapter 3. But chapter 3 opens with Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king, you remember, over the Babylonian Empire. He's the most powerful man on the planet. And that's not an exaggeration at this time in history. He makes an image of gold, a statue, you might say, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Those are the modern dimensions that we would recognize. This image may have been made of wood and stone and overlaid or plated with gold. There's some mention of that type of idol manufacture, even in the Old Testament books of Isaiah and Jeremiah. But the Greek historian Herodotus describes a solid gold image of Baal in Babylon that he saw when he visited there. This would be more than 200 or 300 years after what is recorded in Daniel chapter 3 occurs. And Herodotus says that there was a seated image that had a throne and a table beside of it that was made of over 800 talents or 22 tons of gold. And so that's quite impressive to think about that much of that precious metal being used. It wasn't the same image, it's described differently, but Herodotus said this was certainly something that could be done. And Nebuchadnezzar does it. He sets it up in the plain of Dura. Dura is a little village area that's roughly about, well, I don't know where my PowerPoint went, but anyways, roughly about 6 miles south of the capital city. And Nebuchadnezzar is here, as you see in the workbook, going to try to demand worship to this gold idol or image. Now, you've heard this story again many times, and probably like me, you have at least several questions. You might want to know, well, how soon was it after chapter 2's events do the events in chapter 3 transpire? It seems like Nebuchadnezzar would not be that quick to forget, or maybe that even helps explain why he did what he did. And I'll explain that momentarily. But most people say it was a minimum of about 10 years, at least a decade, between the close of chapter 2 and the events that are described in chapter 3. Well, why did he build it? Why did Nebuchadnezzar build something like this? You might just say, well, to stroke his ego, if you will. Those men in power, and maybe a select few women through history, but men especially, who have ruled in power, whether you call them emperor or king or czar or kaiser or some other moniker, they have no trouble erecting monuments to impress their subjects and to say, look at how important I am. And this was very commonly done in the ancient world. There is some evidence, for instance, that when the Roman Empire expanded, that they took an image, a bust, if you will, of Caesar, and they would kind of put it out as a boundary marker, if you will. And so as you came into a particular region or area and you saw something representing Caesar, you would say, okay, I'm fixing to cross into Roman territory, if you will. And today we have our own images or monuments in this country. By and large, they are not set up during the lifetime of the individual who is honored so as to give them any sort of worship, but after the fact, you can think of the Washington Monument, you can think of the Lincoln Memorial, maybe it's more personified. You can think of the National Mall. As of late, I guess the most recent construction project was the completion of the Martin Luther King Jr. monument that's there. Some of you may have seen that. I've not seen that, but that pays tribute, of course, to the work that he did. Well, is Nebuchadnezzar just saying, you know, everybody look at my image and appreciate what I've done for you and what I give you as a ruler over Babylon? He probably wasn't that humble. The Bible doesn't record for us with any sort of precise detail why, the motivation that prompted Nebuchadnezzar to do this, but there are some ideas that I think are likely. One thought, and really I had not really given much consideration to this until preparing for this class, it could be that Nebuchadnezzar is trying to improve on the dream that he had in chapter 2. Last week when we talked about his dream and the image that he saw there, that image had a gold head, right? What other parts of it, what other metals made up that image? Do you remember? A chest of silver, thighs of bronze, and feet and legs of iron mixed with clay. And the interpretation was, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. You're on top. You're supreme. But that dream also said eventually what would happen? He would be replaced. Inferior kingdoms would succeed him, and eventually God would set up a kingdom that would reign over all. Is Nebuchadnezzar thinking, if I'm the head of gold and I'm supreme and this other image that I had of these inferior metals is going to be destroyed, what if I make an entire image of gold? And maybe that will ensure my posterity. Maybe this will ensure my kingdom will continue. And maybe that's what he's thinking about. I don't know. There is another likely idea, and that is that Nebuchadnezzar, because he did wield such power, thought that there was no external force that could defeat him, but maybe internal sabotage or a coup, as we sometimes call it. And so this action he takes because of political considerations. In fact, there is some evidence, one scholar who has studied this much more in depth than have I, has in his research uncovered some evidence that around late 595 to early 594, there was an attempt to overthrow Nebuchadnezzar's government from inside forces in Babylon. And that may, of course, be true. The Bible doesn't, again, confirm that, but we're talking about historical sources here. So this internal rebellion, though, was put down. Nebuchadnezzar did not lose power, but because that did happen, Nebuchadnezzar said, okay, we're going to make sure that doesn't happen again. And so he summons all the government officials. And there you see in verse 2, for instance, the listing of them. Administrators, satraps, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. And so he had summoned these guys, it seems, from far and wide to come to the capital, or the vicinity of the capital, for the dedication of this image. There is, I guess, some benefit if you wanted to explore and see the difference in each of these administrative offices and what each one of them did. The Bible doesn't specify, so you would only be speculating yourself. But simply put, this is the government bureaucracy, if you will. This is all of those people that had any sway or power or had any ability, if you will, to carry out government business. And Nebuchadnezzar wants to make sure we're all on the same page. Interestingly, it doesn't mention anything here whether the regular people were invited. Maybe they just were expected to show up when this whole incident takes place. Verse number 4 does say, "O peoples, nations, and languages." And so it seems to be universal that all of the people might have been there, but the servants of the state certainly were not excluded. This does raise the question, maybe a third question that most of us have as the story unfolds, especially about the three friends of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We ponder, where is Daniel? And the simple answer is, the Bible makes no mention of him. Was he away from the capital on official government business? Was he on vacation? Maybe they gave him a little R&R and he decided to get out of town. It's possible. Again, 6 miles from the capital city is where this whole ordeal is going to unfold. And so maybe somebody had to stay back in town, to make sure everything ran well there in the absence of the king. I don't know. There is some thought that Daniel might have been a sort of co-regent. Nebuchadnezzar held him in such high esteem that he was, as it were, his right-hand man, his prime minister. And so maybe he was able, if you will, to stand beside Daniel, and Daniel had shown no disloyalty. And so Nebuchadnezzar had no questions about his allegiance, and so maybe he didn't demand this of Daniel, kind of as an act of deference and even respect for the man Daniel. Again, all of these are potential answers, and others like them possible. No definitive answer is given. So what happens? Well, everyone's summoned. And they're summoned with, this gathering of people. I don't know if it's, that everyone's kind of encircling this idol, if they're all standing in formation. Those are just details that you'll have to use your imagination to kind of in your mind picture it. And I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do that. But the instructions are clear. The music is going to sound. And a variety of instruments. You musical people here might be intrigued by the historical background of some of these types of instruments. From my research, a lot of them came from Greece. Greece seemed to be kind of a cradle of musical innovation in that day, and so maybe many of these instruments have their origin in Greek culture. But whatever they were, horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, some versions translate them bagpipes, some versions translate them by the use of other, zithers, harps. I'm not a musical instrument expert. You'll have to, again, try to do your own research to picture what these are about, but it's a grand symphony. Nebuchadnezzar never does anything halfway, okay? He's got the big symphony up here, and he says, when it plays, simple. Music starts, you fall and worship. You show your obeisance, your homage to the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever you are, do that. And so, what did they do? Did they play a symphony? Did they play Rocky Top? I don't know. They probably didn't play Rocky Top, okay? They played something, okay? Some song, some music for some length of time. And, how long did these guys have to stay bowed down? We don't know. But it was pretty obvious, just like when I showed you the picture of Mr. Landmesser up there. If you're in a crowd and everyone else is bowing and you're standing up, unless you're of diminutive height, it'd be pretty easy to see that you were not going along with everybody else. You were bucking the trend. And that's exactly what happens in verse number 8. Certain Chaldeans came forward. You remember we said Chaldeans was a term that could be technically used for just the magicians, sorcerers, the Babylonian sort of arts people. It could refer more generally to the ethnic group of people that lived in and around Babylon. Here, we're not exactly sure. It does seem, at least in my way of thinking, that these Chaldeans here were probably part of that government office of so-called magician, astrologer experts that couldn't interpret the dream in chapter 2. Daniel could, and now these Jews, they're not like us, that Nebuchadnezzar brought in. Now they're, again, kind of standing out. And maybe because these native Babylonians did not receive the praise and the promotion that Daniel and his three friends had, they have a convenient way to accuse them. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, let us get this straight. You made a decree, music sounds, everyone falls down. Yep, that's right. Well, there's a problem. There are certain Jews, verse 12, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are not going to comply. Jonathan's waving at me. Go ahead.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that, hey, I'm not really worshiping. I'm just going to tie my shoe while this is.
Yep. I'm going to, cross my fingers, and tie my shoe, or, my bad knee's going to give out on me right at this time. Is it easy to compromise and justify compromise? Your head like this. It's easy for all of us to do that. And the point is exactly right. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have done that. But they're not going to bend, they're not going to budge, and guess what? They're not going to burn. That's a free sermon for you. 3 B's. All right. So, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they pay no due regard to you. They're just not going to listen. They refuse to serve your God, and they're not going to violate the first 2 of the 10 commandments. That's what's in play here, and I think that kind of goes without saying, but in case you wonder what prompted them not to obey, it wasn't their pride or arrogance, it was their compliance with the first 2 commandments of Exodus 20. And so Nebuchadnezzar, in rage, he's kind of got that sort of personality, fury. The boys are brought before him. What's amazing here is he tempers a little bit of that reaction and doesn't immediately, fly into an act of vengeance or punishment for their disobedience. Boys, maybe you didn't understand. Seems to be the way he approaches them. Maybe it didn't communicate. Maybe some of that, language training I gave you, maybe you missed that chapter on, when we covered what these words meant that I gave earlier. But here, let me make it plain for you again. Music's going to sound. You guys are going to worship, or into the furnace you go. Okay, no problem. That's simple enough. And here's maybe the key hinge of the entire chapter, and really somewhat of the entire book. I know I've said that already about Daniel 2:21. But here's another one of these kind of linchpins in the entire book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar poses this question at the end of verse 15. Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? Don't you know who I am? In essence, he's saying, sticking his chest out. Don't you know the power I possess? You think you serve a God that's superior to me? Don't you? I'm Nebuchadnezzar. Don't you know who I am? Now, here's where we just kind of step aside. I want you to, again, you use your thinking cap. That's what Amy's mama told me in second grade. I must have left it in second grade. She reminds me I need it still today. But anyways, take and put your thinking cap on, your imaginary, thinking cap. I want you to imagine we're going to go beyond this scene. You've got Nebuchadnezzar, whatever he looked like, if he's on a throne or whatever. You've got all of the regalia, and people around him. You see these three Hebrew boys. Now, they're probably dressed well because they're government officials. They're not disheveled or unkept or, dirty, I don't think. But you see all of that scene kind of playing out. You see the symphony over here. You see the statue over here. I want you to kind of transport yourself from that point, though. I want you to go to the throne room of God. Revelation 4 describes it as, a sea of glass mixed with fire and a rainbow over it. If you've never read Revelation 4 and 5 and tried to, again, imagine what the throne room of God looks like, do that this afternoon. You'll be benefited by it. But put yourself in the throne room of God. The angels that continue to worship Him, the 24 elders that fall down and say, worthy are you, day and night, forever and ever in eternity, giving praise to God. You're in the throne room of God. What does God do at this moment? I've got an answer. I don't know that it's the right one, but I want to hear yours. What does God do at this moment? You know what I think He does based on Psalm 2? Okay. I think He put him in that spot for sure. You know what Psalm 2 says He does? Anybody read Psalm 2 lately? You're in the throne room of God. Nebuchadnezzar said, who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? Psalm 2, why do the nations rage? The people plot a vain thing. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. Verse 4, he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. What does God do at this moment? I like to think He lets out a big chuckle belly laugh. I won't do that because it'll reverberate on the power or on the live stream. People listening might not appreciate that, but a big old belly chuckle laugh. God says, you got to be kidding me. This guy who will deliver my people out of His hand? I think God lets out a big belly laugh. Now, is that Bible? You can say, well, you can't say. I know I can't say that, with exact certainty. But I think based on Psalm 2, maybe that's exactly what happens. The derision of heaven. Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Well, to their credit, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, here's their answer. And really, I love how they started. O King, we have no need to answer you in this matter. It's another way of saying we don't have to defend ourselves. You don't even deserve an answer from us. You think you're the big dog, on scene? We don't even have to listen.
Seems like during this period of time, God was a silent thing.
Somewhat. And that's the question. They're in a foreign land. They're away from Jerusalem. They're away from the temple. Is God still involved? Yeah, does He care? And this is going to powerfully prove, of course, that He does. And that's the point. But they start out by saying, King, you don't deserve an answer. We don't have to justify what we're doing before you or try to give you any reason for our disobeying.
It's almost like they're telling him, don't even bother to play the music.
Yeah.
Already decided what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Don't bother.
Yeah. Let the musicians, go for a coffee break. We're not going to do what you've asked us to do. Our mind is set up. We're firm in this belief, or we're firm in our conviction of what's going to happen. Well, if, verse 17, if that is the case, if you've made up your mind, King, we've already made up our mind. If you're going to throw us into the burning fiery furnace, well, go ahead. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, and He will deliver us from your hand. Now, I want you to pay close attention to how they transition in verse 18, because this, I believe, is the perfect mindset that you and I should adopt in our approach to life even today. Verse 18, but if not, but even if he doesn't, you see, they're very careful, I think, to show deference to God and say, we're not telling God what to do. And be sure that, some of us, sometimes we might make that mistake unintentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes our prayers almost take on that flavor of, God, here's what's wrong and here's what you ought to do. And if you'll do it the way I say to do it, it'll turn out the way it should. Don't pray like that. I'm not saying you pray with that sort of bravado, but sometimes, again, that's communicated. These boys aren't, making any demands of God with bravado. They just said, God is able to deliver us. We have confidence that's what He's going to do. But if not, if we're going to defer if He chooses not to, we're not going to serve your gods. We're not going to worship the gold image that you have set up. Just not going to happen. And people have wondered, well, they said this because they knew that if they died, they'd go to heaven. I think that's an incorrect assumption. They knew if they died, God would take care of them. Yes, that's true. But they express no confidence or no even awareness, it seems, of an afterlife or eternity or immortality. And that makes it all the more impressive, I think, in this regard. They simply express their faith and trust in God that what He decided to do would be what was best for them. And that's the approach that you and I need to adopt. And I have to remind myself of it every day. I'll just tell you, whatever transpires, God decides to do in this instance, I'm going to try to be faithful to Him and do what He's asked me to do. And I'm going to trust Him with the results. There is a well-known quote, and let's see, I thought I wrote it down somewhere. Did I write it down on this other page? Okay. Yes. The boys answer, and it can be summarized in this fashion. Duties are ours. Events are the Lord's, or outcomes. I like that. Duties, responsibilities. What God tells us to do, that's our job. The event and the outcome, that belongs to the Lord, whatever He chooses to do with it. And so, that's what happens. And Nebuchadnezzar has probably never been treated thusly, because his expression on his face changes. The best way I can describe that, I can remember a few times when a few of my athletic coaches growing up, I made a bad play and the expression of their face changed. You know, Amy knows who I'm talking about. He's got one prominent, he's like me, he's follically challenged. He's got one prominent vein that goes across his forehead, and you can tell how well the game's going. You don't even have to look at the scoreboard, just how big the vein is going across his forehead. The bigger it is, the worse we're playing, or the worse we played. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar's doing. He is hot. He's angry. His face changes toward them. He commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now that would be impossible. That's hyperbole. The furnace was probably like an old milk bottle glass, if you're thinking. Some people describe it like a beehive. It's narrow at the top, then it kind of spreads out. You can add the fuel at the bottom. You put in, if you're smelting metal or whatever, kind of in the mouth at the top. It might have had some sort of window. It seems it had some sort of viewing area where they could look inside to do it. The furnace may have been used to smelt the gold that was used to produce this image. There's some maybe possibility, and I wish I could show you a picture of that. I don't even have a picture of it, but Google sometime the Ishtar Gate. Beautiful, made of blue brick that stood at the entrance of Babylon. Today it's in a museum in Berlin, what's left of it. There's a replica in Iraq, but it's beautiful. And the way they would glaze those bricks in antiquity is still just a feat that's amazing. And so maybe this furnace here was used either for the idol or maybe for these bricks or some other purpose, but 7 times hotter than usual. I don't know if you've ever been around a very, very intense fire. I know some of you guys, you might have used an acetylene torch, for instance. Yeah, how hot it was, you know, there wasn't a temperature gauge on it, but it was plenty hot enough. Some of you, again, you've been in that sort of environment, if you will. I can tell you again, not because you want to know, I know you don't, but working in my industry, working with a retort in a cremation situation, there's a blast door that's involved in that, and when that door opens, usually interior temperature is anywhere from 1,500 to 1,800 degrees. That's hot. I mean, it just hits you in the face even if you're at a distance from it. And that's what's going on here. These boys are tied up. The command is so urgent, they're thrown into the middle of this fiery furnace. And those who took them up to throw them in, the heat is so intense that they lose their lives. These were probably some of Nebuchadnezzar's best men. We don't know exactly who they are. Now, to his, again, foolishness, the hotter you make the fire, what would happen? The quicker they would burn up. So he's really going to make it easier on them, even though he says, well, I'm going to make it hotter. I'm going to punish you even worse. If they really wanted to punish them, they would have toned the fire down. Some of the early Christian martyrs, it is said that the heathen, whether that be the Romans or others, would sometimes allow mercifully those that were burned at their stake, the family, to come and put green wood down. And you'd say, well, that's kind of weird. What's that about? They would put green wood at the base of the stake so that hopefully that green wood would smoke enough that the person dying at the stake would die of smoke inhalation before the flames did their worst. It's what your early brothers and sisters faced for their faith. That's another story at another time. But anyway, this is serious. And
Was Nebuchadnezzar in the mindset that he's going to lose his position?
I think he was just, he was smarted from their refusal, that his pride was not recognized, his position, his power. He's not worried about his position. He's just like, who do these boys think they am? I'm Nebuchadnezzar. Everyone does what I say when I say to do it, the way I say to do it. And they're going to say, no, there's only one that belongs that sort of obedience and submission, and that's God. So they tie the boys up, throw them in. Nebuchadnezzar probably just looks around at, the people sitting around next to him, said, see, took care of them, didn't I? That's what happened. Anybody else? Anybody else? You want to stand up? You want to not bow down? That's what happens to you. Now, what's amazing is I don't know exactly how much time again elapses. Is it a matter of seconds or minutes, or I don't think it would be an hour, although I guess it could be. Nebuchadnezzar is astonished, and he rose up in haste. He just happens to look over at this viewing area, and he asked his guys next to him, "Thought there are 3 of them we throw bound into the fire." They said, "Yeah, that's right, King. 1, 2, 3. Look, I see 4 men loose," verse 25, "walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. The form of the 4th is like the Son of God." I love that idea, just walking about in the fire. Again, I'm a little bit of a pyromaniac. I can admit that. Growing up on the farm, I'd burn some, just an old fence row or something. And, to watch fire dance and to watch all of the colors that different wood and different materials, that they create when they combust. It's an amazing thing. And they're in the midst of this inferno, this conflagration. And these guys are just walking about. And there's an interesting little apocryphal detail that Carol and I can share with you if you're interested in that. What's happening here? It's quite amazing, but they're enjoying it. They're enjoying it. There's 4 though, not 3. And the 4th form, or the form of the 4th, is like the Son of God, verse 25. Now, what do we do with that? That's an interesting idea. Now, like the Son of God is the New King James Version rendering. Other versions will say, like a son of the gods. One version just said the 4th looks like a god. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar could recognize those 3 boys that he put in there, 3 young men. They maintained their appearance somewhat, as much as you could in a fire. But there was a 4th being, and he looked different than the others, to say the least. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he goes near the mouth of the furnace. He's not going to get close enough to perish himself, but close enough to yell in. And some people say that now there's enough time that has elapsed that the temperature has been reduced enough for him to do that. So maybe they've been in there for a good amount of time. Again, you'll have to speculate how you think best on that regard. But nevertheless, the call comes forward, "Come on out, boys." And they do. Interestingly, again, verse 26, he says, "You're servants of the Most High God." Who's the God that can deliver? Apparently there's some God. Nebuchadnezzar is at least acknowledging at this point. The boys come out and they're examined. No power the fire had on their bodies. Not a hair of their head was singed. You ever singed the hair on your head? I had hair at one time, and I've singed it before, again in my foolishness with fire. Their garments were not affected. There's no burn marks there. And I love this part. The smell of fire was not on them. You can go and sometimes all of us have probably had the unfortunate experience. You get your hotel room and it was supposed to be a non-smoking room, but somebody smoked in it the night before. You've had to spend the night in one of those places. What happens the next morning, even after you check out and you're driving down the road, you go, man, I stink. The smell of that smoke just infiltrated, your clothing. But the smell of fire was not even on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and blessed the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel. Now notice how he changes in verse 28 from son of God to an angel. Who was this being? Was it, as some versions suggest, and as many Christian interpreters have through the centuries assumed, the pre-incarnate Christ? I don't think there's any reason to conclude that definitively, but neither would I say perhaps there is no reason to maybe say that's an impossibility. I just think we'd probably need to leave room either way in that. We know, according to later chapters in this same book, that the angel Gabriel and the angel Michael are both mentioned. They are the only two angels actually named in Scripture. Was it one of those who's here with the boys? Possibly. There is the thought, and I guess you'll have to again take your own understanding along with it. Matthew 28 verse 20, what did Jesus promise? He told his apostles, go into all the world, we teach and preach the gospel. Lo, I am what? With you always, even to the end of the age, the end of the world. How is that accomplished by the Lord? I admit that's the mysterious part. That's the difficult part for us to wrap our minds around. But the care, the protection of God, He promises to be with us. Even if we don't always make it out of the furnace, He's with us. But for these boys, He was certainly there with them, whether it was an angelic being or the pre-incarnate Christ. It matters little. God was involved. That's the point to keep in mind for sure. So Nebuchadnezzar makes a decree, which is interesting because that's how the chapter started. Here's the decree. I'm in charge. You worship me. But now the decree is anyone who says anything amiss or speaks against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God will be cut in pieces. Now, here's something. This will make lunch taste better downstairs in just a little bit. You know how they did that? They found 4 young green trees growing together in pretty close proximity. And they bent those young trees over and tied your arms and legs to those green trees. Now, all of us have taken a tree and bent it over, and it's like a big, a slingshot or a rubber band. You can bend something that's going to, when you let it go. Nebuchadnezzar would take guys up and he'd tie them to those trees and he'd bend them down. And then he'd have those ropes, 4 of them simultaneously cut. Guess what happened if that were you? You'd fling in 4 different directions. Now, don't that make lunch taste better? But Nebuchadnezzar was a serious guy. You disobey me and I'll show you what I'll do to you. It's a fiery furnace. It's, being cut in pieces. I'll make your house a rubbish heap. Some people said that's just like a public bathroom, an ash heap, rubbish, whatever it was, garbage dump. He said, there is no other God who can deliver like this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were further promoted in the province of Babylon. Now, is Nebuchadnezzar a believer? A true follower of the God of heaven? Maybe.
I think he believed that this was the greatest God of the gods, but I don't think he was at the point where he believed it was the one and only God.
And I think that's the right understanding. Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm going to put him along with my other gods. He kind of moves to the front of the line. But maybe some of these other gods, there's also some still validity in them. Now, next week, come back again. We're going to see God and Nebuchadnezzar go another round with each other. And maybe he gets closer to what we would say is a true belief and faith in God. Here are just some questions for us. I say what, but maybe preliminary to that we could ask are. But what are there Christians, or are there idols that non-Christians worship today? Sure. And maybe we wouldn't even have to say non-Christians. Are there idols that Christians worship today? We'd say, we don't have a statue in the backyard, or we don't have a little idol in the living room. No, but they're still idols, things that we put before God. And you can fill in that with what you think. Is it better to die in integrity than to live in iniquity? Absolutely. And hopefully, that will not come to us as the decision to be made in our lives. But if it does, then let us be those who would even die in integrity, faith in God, than live in iniquity. Interesting questions. If you go to Jeremiah chapter 52, the Bible mentions some others that Nebuchadnezzar, Jews that he took back to Babylon. And the question or the observation that Jonathan made earlier that was very pertinent is, what about everybody else? Yes, where is Daniel? I have no question about Daniel. I know he maintained his faith in God. The rest of the book confirms that. But what about the other Jews? Did they assimilate and just go along to get along? Worship the gods of the Babylonians? Just because, hey, when you're in Rome, you got to live like the Romans. When you're in Babylon, you got to live like a Babylonian. That seems to be perhaps what happened. And that's dangerous because in our culture, even this morning, that's what the devil's trying to get us to do. Go along to get along. Just live like a normal American. Don't be devoted to God or the Bible or the church. Don't do that. But who is the God who can deliver us? The same God who delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He can and He will deliver His faithful servants today. Thank you for your good attention. Study with us in class this morning. Read chapter 4 between now and next week to get ready for that then.